The morning I discovered my son and his wife had emptied $138,000 out of my account. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, and I didn't call for help. I sat perfectly still at my kitchen table, coffee going cold beside my hand, and watched the transaction list on my laptop as if it belonged to some other doomed old man. 3 transfers, 3 clean hits, all routed into my daughter-in-law's personal account over 12 days. By dinner, she would smile at me and say they had only taken what I was too old to use wisely. By the end of the week, my own child would threaten to cut me off unless I surrendered the rest. What neither of them understood, what they had somehow managed to overlook while circling me like vultures around a sick animal, was that I had spent 31 years with the Maryland Attorney General's office, most of them investigating financial exploitation, fiduciary fraud, and crimes committed against seniors by the very people they trusted. Most! They thought grief had hollowed me out. They thought age had slowed my mind. They thought I was waiting to be buried beside my wife. What I was actually doing was taking inventory, preserving evidence, and deciding exactly how much rope to give them. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 67 that winter, 14 months into widowhood, and still learning how to occupy a house that had once been animated by my wife's presence in every room. Elaine had died the previous October after a miserable year with ovarian cancer, and the silence she left behind was not the poetic kind people write about in sympathy cards. It was practical silence, no humming from the pantry while she put groceries away, no half-finished crossword on the breakfast counter, no voice from the den telling me I'd forgotten to turn off the porch light. We had been married for 40 years, and for most of those years she had been the social glue of our family. She remembered anniversaries, arranged holiday dinners, soothed arguments before they hardened into grudges, and made my sometimes blunt lawman personality digestible to the rest of the world. After she was gone, the family didn't just seem smaller. It lost its center of gravity. My son, Evan, was 39 and had always been the softer one between the two of us. Sensitive as a boy, eager to please, easily embarrassed by conflict. He worked as a senior project accountant for a regional construction company outside Baltimore, made decent money, and used to call his mother for advice 3 times a week about everything from mortgage refinancing to whether a fever required urgent care. He married Sienna Hart 4 years ago. Sienna was polished in a way that looked effortless until you spent enough time around her to realize how much effort was actually involved. She worked in brand strategy, dressed like every errand was being photographed, and had the kind of expensive preferences people pretend are just personality traits. She talked about destinations instead of vacations, investments instead of savings, and curating a life instead of living one. At first I chalked that up to vanity and a generational appetite for display. Elaine, who saw through people faster than I did in domestic settings, wasn't so charitable. "That girl smiles with her mouth and calculates with her eyes," she told me once after Sunday dinner, then immediately said she hoped she was being unfair. She wasn't. The changes began while Elaine was still sick enough that I excused almost everything. Sienna started volunteering to help with paperwork. She wanted copies of insurance cards in case of an emergency. She asked who handled our taxes, which bank our retirement distributions came from, whether our mortgage was fully paid off, whether I had trouble keeping track of online passwords. Whenever I mentioned a case from my career involving forged authorizations or predatory relatives, she redirected the conversation so smoothly that it would have seemed rude to resist. If I told a story about an 82-year-old man whose nephew slowly isolated him and drained his brokerage accounts, Sienna would laugh lightly and say she couldn't imagine dealing with criminals for a living. If I said some of the worst predators wore wedding rings and carried casseroles, she'd refill someone's wineglass and ask Elaine about a recipe. I always noticed, but my attention belonged to hospital rooms, pill schedules, insurance fights, and the woman I was trying not to lose. I filed my discomfort away because there were more urgent wars to fight. After Elaine died, the campaign changed shape. Concern replaced curiosity. Sienna began saying things like, "Daniel, this is a lot for one person to manage," while standing in my kitchen as though she had been appointed to audit my survival. She asked whether grief was making it hard for me to focus. She said online banking could be dangerous for people under stress. She joked, twice too often, that I was becoming adorably analog whenever I paid a bill from my desktop instead of my phone. If I forgot some harmless detail, like whether I'd told her about a cardiology appointment or repeated the name of a neighbor's grandson, she would glance at Evan in that stage whisper way people use when they want you to hear what they're pretending not to say. "He already mentioned that," she'd murmur. "Remember?" Evan would give a tight little smile and move on. The comments were individually minor. Collectively, they were scaffolding. I had seen it built around victims before: establish frailty, normalize confusion, create a record of gentle public doubt. I started keeping notes again, not because I doubted my memory, but because I trusted my instincts. Old investigators don't really retire, we just relocate our habits. I wrote down dates, times, calls returned and not returned, invitations made and then somehow rerouted through Sienna instead of directly from Evan. Over 6 months, I watched access to my son narrow like the neck of a bottle. If I called him, she often answered first. If he called me, it was usually speakerphone, her voice nearby, filling pauses, correcting details, translating my own life back to me as if I required assistance. Family gatherings shrank. A cousin told me she'd heard I was having a hard time with memory stuff. My brother Neil asked gently whether I had considered letting Evan help manage some finances until I felt steadier. The source of those ideas was obvious. Sienna wasn't just studying my accounts. She was preparing witnesses for a story in which I was the unreliable narrator of my own decline. The day the money vanished was a Monday in January, gray and windless, one of those midwinter mornings when the world looks paused. I logged in to pay quarterly property taxes and saw a checking balance that made no sense at all. 58,000 should not have become 11,000 unless life had taken a sledgehammer to math while I slept. I opened the transaction history, and there they were. $46,000 on December 29th, $54,000 on January 4th, $38,000 on January 10th, all marked as authorized transfers through online banking, all routed into an account ending in 6119. I didn't know that number, but the confirmation emails had been deleted from my inbox and my trash, which told me two things immediately. This had not been random, and the person responsible had enough access to both my computer routines and my personal information to feel safe covering tracks. They assumed I'd never think to check. I called the bank and went straight to the fraud unit. The woman who took my report, a patient professional named Carla, reviewed the transfers line by line. Each one had been approved using my credentials. Each one had passed security questions. Each one appeared, at least superficially, to be a legitimate customer-initiated transfer. I told her I had not authorized a cent and wanted the account frozen before anyone touched another dollar. She warned me correctly that because the activity had been authenticated, the investigation would take time and likely turn into a dispute involving someone known to me. I asked for every available reference number, every timestamp, every IP address the bank could legally provide. When you've spent a career untangling fraud, you learn that panic wastes oxygen and evidence disappears fast. By the time I hung up, I had a yellow legal pad full of notes, a locked account, and the kind of cold certainty that settles in your bones before your mind fully catches up. Then I checked the parts of the scene most people miss: my sent folder, my deleted messages, browser history, password reset notices. 2 confirmation emails had been removed, but not so thoroughly that their absence looked natural. Someone had deleted only what mattered and left the ordinary clutter behind, which is exactly the kind of selective cleaning amateurs think makes them invisible. I found a recent login from a device I didn't recognize and a failed attempt to change my backup authentication number the week before the first transfer. I remembered Sienna borrowing my phone at Christmas dinner because hers had died, and she needed to send herself a photo Elaine used to keep framed in the hallway. At the time it had seemed like nothing. In hindsight, it looked like reconnaissance conducted while I was carving ham for people who had already started pricing my life in pieces. That evening, Evan called and said he and Sienna needed to come over to clear up a misunderstanding. His voice sounded thin, the way it used to when he was 10 and trying to explain a broken lamp before I saw the baseball on the floor. They arrived exactly on time. Sienna wore cream slacks, a navy sweater, and her compassionate face. She carried a leather portfolio. Evan looked like he hadn't slept. I let them sit in the living room where Elaine used to insist we keep real conversations. Before either of them started, I said, "Someone transferred $138,000 from my account into Sienna's account without my permission." Evan stared at his shoes. Sienna set her portfolio on her knees and tilted her head with practiced sadness. "Daniel," she said, "that's not what happened. You told us you wanted to help. You were emotional. You were talking about legacy, and you said you'd rather see family use the money now than let it just sit there." The lie was not clumsy. That was what made it dangerous. She delivered it as though she was reminding me of a conversation I had merely misplaced. Evan chimed in quietly and said I had mentioned helping them with a larger house, maybe starting a college fund someday for a future child, doing something meaningful while I could enjoy seeing it. I asked for proof, an email, a text, a note, a signed instruction, any documentary evidence at all that I had agreed to send them $138,000 in 3 separate transfers. Sienna said I had called her multiple times because I trusted her organizational skills. I told her on the dates in question I had records placing me elsewhere, including a cardiology visit, a lunch with my old colleague Martin Ruiz, and an afternoon spent at Greenmount Cemetery talking to my wife's headstone like a crazy old man with a good reason. Sienna didn't flinch. She just softened her voice even further and said, "Daniel, this is exactly why we're worried. You don't remember the conversations, and that's okay. No one is judging you. But pretending they never happened is scaring Evan." Then came the real purpose of the visit. Sienna slid a packet halfway out of the portfolio and said maybe it was time to discuss a more structured arrangement. Just temporary, just until things stabilized. Perhaps Evan could have limited financial authority to make sure bills were paid on time. Perhaps both of them could help monitor accounts so misunderstandings didn't spiral into accusations. She used phrases like safety net and peace of mind. I heard power of attorney hiding under every syllable. I also heard impatience. They had taken money, expected confusion, encountered resistance, and were now accelerating toward full control before I could regain my footing. I looked at my son and asked whether this was really what he wanted. He swallowed, rubbed his palms on his pants, and said he only wanted what was best for me. It was a sentence so generic it could have been printed on poison. After they left, I took Elaine's wedding ring from the box where I keep it and held it in my palm for a long time. Grief and betrayal are different wounds, but they burn together in strange ways. I missed my wife with a physical ache that had not lessened in 14 months, and now I had to admit she had been right about the woman our son married. Worse than that, I had to accept that my son was not merely trapped beside her. He was participating. There are truths you can postpone and truths you cannot afford to postpone. By midnight, I had made up my mind. I was not going to confront them again until I knew exactly how far this went. If my own family intended to build a legal case for my incompetence while stealing from me, then I would investigate them the way I had investigated anyone who mistook age for weakness. The emotional reckoning would come later. Evidence came first. The next morning I drove to a diner in Towson and met Martin Ruiz, who had been my closest partner for 13 years on a financial crimes task force before retiring from the Inspector General's office. Martin was 69, broad-shouldered, sarcastic, and incapable of pretending a situation was less ugly than it was. I laid out the facts. The transfers, the shifting narrative, the preemptive whispers about my memory, the proposed authority over my finances. He listened without interrupting, then said, "Danny, if I got this file from a stranger, I'd label it developing elder exploitation and assume the next step was total asset capture." He reminded me that Maryland, like many states, allowed one-party consent recordings in most situations where I was a participant. He also gave me the number of an attorney named Claire Donnelly, who specialized in elder abuse, fiduciary litigation, and emergency protective actions involving financial predators inside families. "You already know what this is," he said as he stirred terrible diner coffee. "The hard part isn't identifying it. The hard part is accepting that your son may be willing to stand next to it while it happens." Claire Donnelly confirmed what Martin suspected and added a crucial piece of information I had nearly forgotten in the fog after Elaine's death. 2 years before she died, we had established an irrevocable trust to hold the bulk of our assets, partly for tax reasons and partly because we had both seen too many late-life horror stories among friends. I remembered signing the documents, of course, but had not revisited them recently because the everyday checking and savings accounts covered my living expenses. Claire pulled the file and reviewed the structure with me in her office. $890,000 sat protected beyond the reach of any casual transfer scheme. Access was restricted, disbursements were controlled, and the trust included a no-contest, no-abuse clause that allowed any beneficiary who financially exploited me to be disinherited. The people stealing from me had gotten hold of my operating cash, not the core of the estate. That did not make the theft smaller. It made their ignorance more useful. Claire asked who had motive, and I gave her what I knew about Sienna's appetite for luxury. She recommended a licensed investigator she trusted for discreet financial background work. Within 4 days, that investigator, Ron Batiste, brought me a summary that made the theft look less like entitlement and more like desperation. Sienna had accumulated enormous personal debt over the preceding 18 months. Margin losses from reckless options trading, credit lines against her car, cash advances, and several private loans funneled through online lenders at ruinous rates. Her social media life, the boutique hotel weekends, the handbags, the spontaneous dinners in D.C., was financed almost entirely on borrowed money. Ron also found indications that Evan's finances were under acute strain. He had recently borrowed from a 401k, maxed 2 cards, and made a series of unexplained cash deposits that suggested money was being moved around to patch holes. They were not stealing from me because they were greedy in the abstract. They were stealing because their whole lifestyle was a painted storefront propped up by debt. There was more. Ron discovered a civil complaint, filed quietly against a small consulting side business Sienna had launched the prior year. A former client alleged misrepresentation and failure to deliver contracted work. No judgment yet, but legal fees were mounting. Evan's employer had also begun an internal review of project cost irregularities tied to jobs he supervised. Nothing public, nothing charged, but enough smoke to suggest a fire somewhere under his polished, obedient exterior. It was all starting to line up with the pattern I had seen many times before. One reckless personality driving the scheme, one conflict-averse spouse rationalizing participation, and one older relative selected as the easiest available reservoir of cash because family access can substitute for technical skill. The danger was not just what they had already taken. It was what debt does to people once theft becomes normalized. A person who talks herself into the first crime can talk herself into the 10th with remarkable speed. That night I pulled an old cardboard file from the closet marked EVAN school papers and sat on the floor going through drawings, report cards, and a Father's Day card he made in 2nd grade with crooked blue letters that said MY Dad CATCHES Bad GUIS. I don't know why I did it, except that part of me needed evidence of the boy before I continued building the case against the man. I found the newspaper clipping he had once taken to show and tell when my office helped shut down a guardianship fraud ring. I had written him a note on the back then. Always tell the truth the first time. It saves pain later. I sat there with that note in my hand and understood something brutal about family betrayal. Strangers steal your money, but relatives also steal the version of the future where you believed your love had taught them enough to resist becoming predators. I decided not to wait for them to make the next move. Instead, I called Sienna directly 3 days after our living room confrontation. I used a recording app Claire had helped me set up, tested twice, volume checked, battery full. When she answered, her tone was honeyed enough to pour over pancakes. I told her I had been thinking about what she said and wanted to make sure I understood the situation because maybe I had overreacted. She relaxed instantly. You could hear it in the slight drop of her guard. She said everyone had been so worried about me, that stress and grief do terrible things to recall, that no one blamed me for feeling disoriented. I asked her to walk me through, step by step, how I had supposedly decided to transfer $138,000. She obliged in detail, inventing phone calls, emotional confessions, and generous intentions with the confidence of a woman who had rehearsed the story enough times to mistake it for fact. Then I asked the question I knew would expose the rot beneath the performance. I said, "Be honest with me, Sienna. Are you and Evan doing this because you think I don't have much time left anyway?" There was a pause just long enough to reveal calculation. When she answered, she gave a little laugh, soft and almost affectionate, and said she thought it was better to be realistic than sentimental. I had high blood pressure, a heart history, grief, and noticeable changes. People my age could decline quickly. Better, she said, for family resources to start helping the next generation while I was still around to feel useful. She did not say the word death right away. She circled it like a decorator choosing paint, then finally admitted that, no, she did not imagine I would be managing finances independently for another 10 years. 5, maybe, 7 if I was lucky. It was one of the coldest things I have ever heard, and I spent half my life listening to men explain why they forged their mother's signature. I kept nudging. If I was forgetting things, I asked, what exactly did she think should happen? This time she said the quiet part out loud. Full authority should shift to people I trusted. Bills, investments, insurance, property taxes, all of it. She said it would relieve me of stress and protect me from my own mistakes. I asked whether she meant Evan should control everything even if I objected to a decision. She said objections are precisely why legal authority exists when someone's judgment starts slipping. She was so certain of herself, so convinced she had reduced me to a manageable old man with no leverage, that she mistook confession for persuasion. When we hung up, I sat in my parked car outside the grocery store where I had placed the call and listened to the recording twice. The second time, I stopped being hurt long enough to become useful again. Claire nearly smiled when she heard it. Martin called it a gift-wrapped indictment, but recordings alone were not enough if we wanted to shut every door they might try to open later. Claire wanted them on the record, in a formal setting, stating their intentions clearly and tying those intentions to specific assets and authority. So she proposed something elegant. She would contact them as my attorney and say I had calmed down, reflected, and was willing to discuss structured assistance with finances in a neutral legal environment. If they believed I was yielding, they would come prepared not merely to defend the theft, but to formalize the next phase. Greedy people are often most vulnerable at the moment victory seems imminent. Sienna accepted the invitation within an hour. She even asked whether she should bring draft power of attorney forms. Claire told her that would be appropriate. While that meeting was being arranged, another blow landed. Evan called me late one evening, and I knew before he spoke that whatever remained of our relationship was about to suffer damage that could not be neatly repaired. He said he needed clarity. He said Sienna was devastated that I had accused her of stealing after everything they had done to support me through Elaine's illness and death. He said my suspicion was pushing them away. Then his voice hardened, not with strength but with borrowed conviction, and he told me that if I wanted them in my life going forward, I had to do 3 things. I had to apologize to Sienna for accusing her of fraud. I had to acknowledge that my memory about recent financial conversations was unreliable, and I had to seriously consider signing documents that would allow them to protect me from future mistakes. I asked him what happened if I refused. He was quiet long enough for me to hear him breathing. Then he said, "Then we step back completely, Dad. No visits, no help, no calls. We can't keep doing this if you're going to make us the enemy." That sentence hurt more than discovering the theft. Money is paper and numbers and labor translated into storage. A son is supposed to be flesh of your flesh, proof that some part of you continues walking after you're gone. Hearing my own child weaponize abandonment so he could obtain control over my finances felt like standing in a room where gravity had failed. I asked him if he understood what he was saying. He insisted they were trying to protect me from confusion and paranoia. He said I was making it impossible for them to care for me. I wanted to ask where, exactly, love ended and extortion began in his mind. Instead, I told him I needed time. After he hung up, I sat alone in my den until after midnight with all the lights off, looking at the reflection of my own face in the dark window. People talk about betrayal like a single stab. The truth is it can feel more like erasure. Someone takes your history with them and rewrites it as evidence against you. The family meeting took place 4 days later in Claire Donnelly's conference room, a high-ceilinged suite overlooking a frozen harbor that looked as hard and metallic as a blade. Claire had arranged for everything to be properly documented. Martin sat in an adjacent office with an investigator from Adult Protective Services and a detective from County Financial Crimes who had been briefed in advance. The point was not theatrics. The point was options. If Sienna and Evan said what we expected them to say, administrative, civil, and criminal avenues could all move quickly. They arrived dressed for the role of dutiful rescuers. Sienna carried a folio thick with documents. Evan looked tense but almost relieved, as if he thought this meeting might finally end the unpleasant phase where I resisted the future he and his wife had selected for me. Claire opened with formalities, confirmed that the conversation would be recorded for legal accuracy, and asked them to explain in their own words why they believed intervention was necessary. Sienna performed beautifully. She spoke about concern, cognitive changes, mounting confusion, forgotten decisions, emotional volatility, and the difficulty of watching someone you love lose confidence in his own judgment. She said I had initiated the transfer of $138,000 to assist them with housing stability and future family planning, then later forgot authorizing it and became accusatory. She said the episode demonstrated precisely why broader supervision was needed. Claire asked whether the supervision she envisioned would include access to all of my liquid assets. Sienna said yes. Claire asked whether it would extend to investment accounts, property decisions, and control over disbursements. Again, Sienna said yes. Claire asked what would happen if I disagreed with how my money was being used. Sienna, now fully comfortable, replied that disagreement was common when older adults resisted necessary support, and that legal authority existed to prevent impulsive or self-damaging interference. Evan added that someone had to protect me from myself. My own son said that while sitting 3 feet away from me and not once looking me in the eye. Claire let the silence breathe for a moment, then opened a binder and began laying documents on the polished table one by one. Trust instruments, asset schedules, certified bank records. She said, very calmly, that the largest share of my estate had been placed beyond their reach years earlier. She explained the abuse disinheritance clause in language even a distracted jury could understand. She then asked whether either of them wished to revise any prior statements in light of the fact that the money they had already taken did not, in fact, represent my principal wealth, and that their own eligibility to inherit anything substantial was conditioned on not exploiting me. It was the first moment Sienna lost color. She looked at Evan. Evan looked at me. No one spoke. Claire then played the recording of my call with Sienna. Hearing her own voice fill that room, speculating about my remaining years, suggesting I should feel useful by financing them before I died, advocating complete authority over my life, stripped her performance down to bare metal. Her reaction was not shame. It was fury. She accused me of tricking her, of baiting a private conversation, of setting a trap. Claire reminded her that I had every right to document a conversation about my own money and welfare. Then the detective entered with Martin and the APS investigator. The detective identified himself, explained that an inquiry into suspected elder financial exploitation was now active, and advised them not to destroy records or attempt to move funds. Evan looked like he might be sick. Sienna, even then, tried to recover. She said families say things clumsily in emotional situations. That context mattered, that the transfer had been intended as assistance, that I was confused and punishing them because I regretted generosity. The detective responded by placing copies of bank metadata on the table showing transfers executed from an unfamiliar device location associated with their home network, paired with deletion activity from my email shortly afterward. Claire added Ron's findings about Sienna's debts. The room changed temperature after that. Truth has a way of using silence like a hammer. Evan broke before Sienna did. Not publicly, not nobly, but visibly. He whispered "Jesus" into his hands and stared at the table. Sienna snapped at him to stop panicking. Claire asked one more question, almost gently. Had either of them accessed my online banking without written authorization? Evan said nothing. Sienna said they had only used information I had previously shared with family. Claire asked whether that included my password reset prompts, security questions, and one-time authentication text routing. Still silence, then Evan said we were going to put it back. It was the saddest defense I have ever heard, not because I believed it, but because it revealed how small he had become inside himself. He was no longer even pretending this was help. He was bargaining with moral debris. The detective noted the statement. Sienna finally stood, shoved back her chair, and hissed that everyone was blowing this out of proportion over money that would have been theirs eventually. There it was, the inheritance logic, the future ownership fantasy that turns living parents into inconvenient obstacles between entitled adults and imagined assets. The criminal investigation widened fast after that. Once subpoena power entered the picture, the paper trail grew teeth. Sienna had not merely received my funds, she had immediately used a chunk of them to cover delinquent loan balances and margin calls. Another portion had gone toward luxury expenses she later tried to describe as pre-planned, though the timing betrayed her. More damaging still, investigators at Evan's employer, alerted discreetly through counsel, accelerated their internal review and found that he had been shifting small amounts across project budgets for months to conceal overruns and shore up personal cash flow. It was not mastermind embezzlement. It was frightened, incremental theft by a man who kept telling himself he was one correction away from making everything whole. That kind of fraud is common because it grows in tiny rationalized steps. You don't wake up a criminal. You practice being one until the label stops startling you. Friends ask me sometimes whether the legal part felt satisfying. The honest answer is yes and no. There is satisfaction in watching lies collapse under documentation. There is relief in seeing predators, even familial ones, meet consequences instead of harvesting an elderly person into silence. But justice is not the same as joy. I sat through interviews, affidavits, evidentiary reviews, motions hearings, and settlement conferences with the same son whose first little league glove I once oiled at the kitchen sink because he wanted it broken in like the good player's gloves. There is no version of accountability that makes that kind of memory painless. Still, pain cannot be allowed to veto truth. Too many older people surrender because exposing family feels worse than being robbed by them. Predators know that. Shame is one of their favorite tools. I refused to carry theirs. The civil side resolved before the criminal side did. Claire obtained emergency injunctive relief that froze remaining transferred funds and barred further contact regarding my finances outside counsel. The bank ultimately credited part of the loss back, while recovery actions proceeded against Sienna directly, and restitution orders later covered the balance. The trust was amended to tighten oversight even further. Beneficiary designations were revised. The share that would once have gone unquestioned to Evan was placed in a suspended conditional provision requiring years of documented rehabilitation, independent counseling, full restitution, and sustained non-exploitative conduct before any future consideration. I did not erase him from existence. I simply stopped confusing biology with entitlement. If blood alone guaranteed moral claim, half my case files from the old days would never have existed. What surprised me most was how many people quietly urged me to make it disappear. A cousin said prison would ruin Evan's life, as if theft, coercion, and attempted legal control of a widowed father were minor youthful mistakes. A former neighbor suggested I keep it private because family business should stay inside the family. Even one old golfing acquaintance asked whether I really wanted the scandal at my age. That reaction taught me why so many abusers target older relatives with confidence. They are counting not just on fear, but on the community's appetite for denial. People would rather call something tragic than criminal if the criminal once brought potato salad to a cookout. I stopped explaining myself after a while. Anyone who needed this simplified into a sad misunderstanding was volunteering to become useful to the next predator they met. Criminal court was where illusion died. Sienna entered not guilty pleas with enough indignation to power a generator, then watched the state assemble a timeline so methodical even her attorney eventually shifted toward damage control. The recording mattered. The transfer metadata mattered. My contemporaneous notes mattered. Her debt history mattered. The testimony from relatives she had quietly primed to doubt my memory mattered. Patterns matter in court because patterns reveal intention. This was not a misunderstanding between generations. It was a staged erosion of credibility paired with unauthorized asset removal and an attempted expansion into legal control. Evan pleaded to reduced charges related to unlawful access and financial exploitation after cooperating about the mechanics of the transfers. I am not proud that hearing him admit the facts under oath brought me relief, but it did. Sometimes the truth from your child's own mouth is the only thing that can cauterize a wound that keeps reopening. Sienna went to prison. Not forever, not as long as the damage she caused will last, but long enough to puncture the fantasy that smart clothes and therapeutic language can sanitize theft. Evan received a custodial sentence as well, shorter but real, followed by supervision, restitution obligations, and mandatory counseling. The day it happened, I did not celebrate. I came home, opened Elaine's old recipe box for no sensible reason, and found one of her index cards stained with vanilla and cinnamon from some Christmas long ago. She used to say that character is what people do when they think love excuses them from consequences. I sat at the kitchen table reading that card until dusk and realized I had spent the entire case, in some buried way, still hoping she would somehow walk back in and tell me how to carry this. Losing a spouse teaches you that some tasks remain yours no matter how tired you are. Defending your own dignity is one of them. In the months after sentencing, the house changed. Not physically at first, though I eventually repainted the den and replaced the front lock out of principle. The real change was that it stopped feeling like a museum to what had been done to me. I began using the space again, as if my life were still underway instead of concluded. Claire introduced me to a statewide coalition that trained older adults on recognizing coercive financial control, especially by relatives. Martin dragged me to one of their workshops and volunteered me to speak. I told the room exactly what I have told you here. Exploitation does not always arrive wearing menace. Sometimes it arrives with soup, concern, and an offer to simplify things. Sometimes it starts with harmless jokes about memory. Sometimes it begins the week after a funeral, when everyone assumes grief has made you too exhausted to notice your world being inventoried. The people in that room listened the way drowning people watch a shoreline appear. That first talk turned into others. Libraries, church basements, senior centers, community college auditoriums, estate planning panels. I showed people how to document small incidents before they become large losses. I told them to diversify who knows what, never let one relative monopolize communication, and never dismiss repeated comments about confusion as casual if those comments reliably precede questions about money. I urged them to consult attorneys before problems arise, not after. Most of all, I told them that feeling embarrassed is natural but fatal if it keeps you quiet. The crimes that hurt most are often the ones victims are trained to hide for the sake of family privacy. Privacy is useful. Secrecy is what predators ask for. The distinction can save a life. Not everything turned into mission or purpose. Some of it remained plain sorrow. My relationship with Evan did not evaporate, but it became a long corridor with locked doors and occasional echoes from the far end. He wrote to me twice from prison. The first letter sounded like self-pity dressed as remorse. The second sounded more honest. He admitted he had let fear of financial collapse turn him into someone he would once have despised. He admitted he hid behind Sienna because it was easier than admitting he had failed as a husband, a provider, and a son. I wrote back once. I told him remorse is not language. It is labor performed over years without guarantees. I said I hoped he did the work whether or not it restored anything between us. Forgiveness offered too cheaply is just permission in better clothes. There were nights, especially in the first spring after everything came down, when I still woke up angry enough to taste metal. I would hear the furnace kick on, see the strip of moonlight across the dresser, and remember Sienna's voice saying I should feel useful while I still had time. On those nights, I understood why some victims shrink instead of fight. Fighting requires reliving the insult in slow motion until a court, a bank, or a bureaucracy finally agrees that what happened to you counts. It is exhausting work, and age does not make exhaustion easier. But each time I considered how simple silence might have been. I thought of all the case files I had worked where the victim died before anyone ever called the theft what it was. I refused to leave my own story arranged neatly for someone else's convenience. The funny thing about surviving a betrayal like this is that other truths become easier to see. I reconnected with my brother Neil in a way we had not managed in years because there was nothing left to pretend around. He admitted Sienna had spent a long time feeding him careful concerns about my stability. He felt ashamed for listening. I told him manipulation works best when it borrows the voice of care. Shame was unnecessary if he learned from it. I also started spending time with a widow named Marion, whom I met at a grief support group I had nearly quit attending after the third session. Her husband had died of a stroke, and she had her own stories about adult children abruptly developing deep interest in account access and home titles. We drank coffee, compared notes on casseroles people bring you when they don't know what else to do, and discovered that late-life companionship is less about fireworks than about being understood without explanation. That understanding felt miraculous enough. People ask whether I ever saw warning signs in Evan as a boy. That question haunts parents because it suggests character defects arrive fully labeled if only we pay attention. The truth is less comforting. He was kind once. He was funny. He cried when our dog died. He held his mother's hand in hospital hallways when he thought I wasn't looking. Human beings do not travel in straight moral lines. Pressure, vanity, fear, resentment, and proximity to a stronger will can twist them into shapes their younger selves would not recognize. That does not excuse what he did. It explains why evil inside families so often looks disappointingly ordinary. It is not always a monster bursting through the door. Often it is compromise accumulating interest. What saved me, if I'm being precise, was not toughness alone. People love stories about old professionals outsmarting criminals because they flatter the idea that skill makes you invulnerable. Skill helped, yes. My training helped. My habits helped. But what truly saved me was that Elaine and I made legal decisions years before crisis, and that when my instincts whispered something was wrong, I respected them instead of editing them into politeness. Older people are often pressured to stay agreeable, because disagreement gets recast as confusion. I had seen that trick too many times not to recognize it when it brushed against my own life. Still, recognition required action. There is no prize for privately understanding your exploitation while continuing to fund it. If you want the blunt ending, here it is. I got most of the money back. I kept the house. I protected the trust. The woman who thought my nearing death entitled her to my resources lost her freedom, her reputation, and the future she tried to build on theft. My son lost years he can never reclaim, and whatever version of father and son we might have remained had he chosen differently at any of the 100 small intersections where this could still have been stopped. On paper, that sounds like victory. In life, it feels more complex. Victory is a courtroom word. At home, what I feel is steadier and quieter. I feel intact. I still visit Elaine every Sunday. I bring fresh flowers when the weather allows and stand there longer than makes sense to anyone in a hurry. I tell her about the workshops, about Marion, about Neil, about the new lock on the front door she would have approved of instantly. I tell her I finally listened to what she saw in Sienna long before I did. And sometimes, when the air is still and the cemetery feels like a place outside time, I admit the part that hurts most. Not that they believed I was old, but that they believed old meant helpless, available, and nearly finished. They were wrong about all of it. Grief did not end me. Age did not soften my edges into surrender. And family, when it failed, did not get the last word. I did. I'm still here, still clear, still dangerous to anyone who mistakes kindness for weakness, and still more than capable of protecting what remains of my life from people who only learned how to measure it in dollars.